Negotiations for the peace settlement were held in Paris in 1919. They were dominated by the Council of Four. There was Clemenceau, whose main concern was for the security of France. There was Wilson from the United States. His main concern was to create a new world order. There was Lloyd George from Great Britain. He mediated between the other two. And then Orlando from Italy, who wielded very little influence. The largest effects of World War I were the territorial changes in Europe. These changes create a lot of new states, which sets up a lot of the causes for World War II. The main common aims of the statesmen were to destroy German militarism, which had almost defeated its rivals single-handedly. They wanted to restore stability in the states where established regimes had disappeared. They also wanted to redraw the map of Europe, satisfying the aspirations of various nationalist movements, and lastly, to create a new world order in which such a general war could not happen again. Peace treaties were drawn up separately with each defeated powers and signed in various places around Paris, from which they took their names. The Treaty of Versailles was signed with Germany on June 28, 1919. German territorial losses were significant. Alsace-Lorraine went to France, Eupen and Malmedy went to Belgium, Northern Schleswig went to Denmark, Pomerania in West Prussia was created as the Polish corridor, and a part of Silesia went to Poland. Danzig was to be administered by the League of Nations, Memel to Lithuania. Also, the Saar and its produce would go to the League of Nations for 15 years. The produce of the coalfields would go to France for the first 5 years. Allied armies of occupation were placed west of the Rhine and east of the Rhine at 3 bridgeheads. All overseas German territories were to go to the League of Nations, which gave mandates to Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Japan to administer them. German concessions and trading rights in China and Egypt were forfeit. As part of Germany's punishment, they were forbidden to unite with Austria, which was now entirely German in population. Military restrictions were imposed. A demilitarized area was established 30 miles east of the Rhine. The general staff was abolished. The army was limited to 100,000 men. The navy was to be handed over to the Allies. No submarines were to be built or maintained. No military air force was to be maintained. Fortifications along France were to be demolished. And lastly, their treaty with Russia was to be regarded as void, and Germans were to withdraw from the Baltic provinces. The War Guilt Clause placed sole blame for the war on Germany. Its main purpose was not so much to assign blame as to provide the justification for requiring Germany and its allies to pay compensation. The amount of financial reparations to be levied was set at a later date. The Americans and the French disagreed on the sum Germany should pay. The Americans had hardly suffered at all, and they ended the war in a wealthier position than when it began, so they thought that Germany should pay a smaller sum. France, on the other hand, had ended the war in debt. They had suffered considerable destruction and dislocation by the German invasion, and they also had considerable losses of life. They also considered hindering and slowing down the German recovery to be in the best interest of France, so they wanted a high sum. In a compromise solution, Germany had to pay only for the losses to civilians and their property. In May 1921, the reparations were fixed at 132 billion gold marks. If the main reason for fighting the First World War was to prevent German dominance of the continent, the French idea of breaking up Germany would have been a reasonable one. There would have been no Germany to retaliate, and also Germany had only been a single country since 1871, so many Germans still identified with their country of origin. For instance, Bavaria definitely regretted the dominance of Prussia and longed for its local independence. Also, the U.S. idea of treating Germany lightly would have enabled Germany to return to the community of nations without an inheritance of resentment. Blaming Germany for the war and imposing reparations was unfair given the complexity of the causes of the war, and unwise because it gave Germans a sense of injustice which could later be exploited by nationalists. The imposition of reparations on Germany deprived it of its agricultural land, its coal, its iron ore, and its manufacturing capability, and it created an economic crisis. The Treaty of Saint-Germain was signed with Austria on September 10, 1919. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was to be broken up. Austria and Hungary became separate states. The new state of Czechoslovakia was recognized. The new state of Yugoslavia was created. Parts of the former Austrian Empire were given to Poland, Romania, and Italy. The boundaries of Austria were defined with a plebiscite vote. Austria was also forbidden to unite with Germany without the League of Nations approval. Limits were placed on the size and composition of the Austrian armed forces, and a war indemnity was imposed on Austria, the amount to be determined later by a commission. The Treaty of Triton with Hungary, signed on June 4, 1920. As stated, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up. Hungary was reduced in size by the creation of new nations and the expansion of Romania, also known as Transylvania, which created a future problem. Limitations were placed on the size and composition of the Hungarian armed forces. Hungary was also liable to pay a war indemnity, the amount to be determined later. The breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was particularly unfortunate. Minorities were left in all the new states, and these minorities were much more conscious of their inferior status in the new, supposedly national states than they had been in the old multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire. For example, there were Hungarians in Romania, and Germans in Czechoslovakia, and Slovaks in Czechoslovakia, and Slovens and Croats in Yugoslavia. Many states were left with border disputes, like Czechoslovakia with Poland, and Hungary with Romania, and Yugoslavia with Italy. The new borders cut across the old trading area of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, based upon the river Danube. The new national rivalries ensured that these became obstacles to trade and the development of the region. Vienna, a cosmopolitan center of culture and learning, slipped towards provincial status. Many of the Germans in the rump of the old empire would wish to unite with Germany, adding to its territory and strength. The creation of small nation-states out of the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the stimulation of nationalism, which would later entail and was a deliberate attempt to reduce appeal of social revolution and Bolshevism in the area. Forbidding the union of Austria with Germany ran counter to the professed respect of the Allies for the principle of self-determination. Bulgaria did lose territory to the emerging state of Yugoslavia, but it gained territory from Turkey. Turkey is going to lose much of its empire, yet start on a time of revitalization under Mustafa Kemal. Also, the new treaty will be reorganized by 1923. The previous redrawing of the map in Europe in 1815 led to a state of general peace for 99 years. This attempt was to last for barely 20. The defeated states regarded the treaty as unjust. The Allies claimed to be redrawing the map on the basis of national self-determination, yet they were inconsistent. They ignored self-determination when Germans or Hungarians were involved. The war guilt clause was also considered unjust. Many of the allies of the victors were disappointed with the treaties. The allies were also inconsistent when joining up the West Slavs, or the Czechs and the Slovaks in Czechoslovakia, and the South Slavs when they combined the Serbs, Montenegrins, Croats, Slovens, and Bosnians in Yugoslavia. The statesman considered that many small states, or balkanization, would lead to a power vacuum which would cause regional instability. The Italians were dissatisfied with their gains. The Japanese were incensed at their failure to have a statement of racial equality written into the covenant of the League. The Chinese were angry that German concessions in China had been given to Japan. The new states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were almost as multinational as the Austro-Hungarian Empire they replaced, which was considered out of date precisely for that reason. Both fell apart on their own accord in the 1990s, Czechoslovakia peacefully and Yugoslavia violently.